For the American soldiers of the 16th Infantry Regiment, it was a task that bordered on the suicidal. They were the leading edge of the Allied invasion force, aimed directly at the heart of Omaha Beach's formidable defenses. On that fateful day in June, these men would demonstrate that when elaborate plans disintegrate, the raw courage of an individual soldier becomes the last and only hope. The burden placed upon them seemed beyond what any person could bear. Beyond his rifle, ammo, and standard gear weighing over 50 pounds, every soldier carried a message from the Supreme Commander, a note that underscored the gravity of their purpose. You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. A fragile, scattered procession of small landing craft, each one packed with 30 to 40 shivering, seasick, and drenched soldiers, churned toward one of the most fortified shorelines in modern history. In this contemporary view, the imposing cliffs that guard the now tranquil Omaha Beach still stand. They were steering directly into a nightmare, tasked with shattering Hitler's supposedly unbreakable Atlantic Wall along the French coast. Nazi Germany had dominated the continent since the fall of France in 1940, when the British were forced into a desperate evacuation at Dunkirk. Now, on June 6, 1944, it was time for retribution. The soldiers in this initial assault, Force O, belonged to the 16th Regimental Combat Team from Major General Clarence R. Hubner's 1st Infantry Division, the renowned Big Red One, already seasoned by intense fighting in North Africa and Sicily. MC Trinker 1. But they wouldn't be alone. Attached to them for the operation, codenamed Overlord, was the 116th Regimental Combat Team of Major General Charles Gerhardt's 29th Infantry Division, a highly trained but untested unit. The 16th, led by Colonel George A. Taylor, was assigned to land on sectors Easy Red and Fox Green of the 5-mile stretch of sand named Omaha. The 116th was slated for the adjacent sectors to the west, Dog Green, Dog White, and Dog Red. 4 transport ships, the USS Samuel Chase, USS Henrico, USS Dorothea M. Dix, and HMS Empire Anvil, had delivered the 1st Infantry Division to a central meeting point in the English Channel, nicknamed Piccadilly Circus. From there, the men moved to smaller vessels for the final approach. Companies E and F of the 16th Regiment's 2nd Battalion were set to land on Easy Red just after 32 amphibious Sherman tanks of the 721st Tank Battalion hit the beach at H hour, or 6:30. Simultaneously, on Fox Green, the easternmost part of Omaha, Companies I and L were to make their landing. Easy Red would then be reinforced by Companies G and H, while Fox Green would receive support from Companies K and M. An hour later, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert C. Hicks, Jr.'s 2nd Battalion, was scheduled to arrive, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Edmund F. Driscoll's 1st Battalion and the artillery of Lieutenant Colonel George W. Gibbs' 7th Field Artillery Battalion. After them came Force B, Colonel George A. Smith, Jr.'s 18th Infantry Regiment. By early afternoon, Colonel John F.R. Seitz's 26th Infantry Regiment would land. It was a meticulously planned timetable, but as combat veterans know, the reality of battle never follows a script. Aboard the HMS Empire Anvil in the pre-dawn gloom, 21-year-old Private Steve Kellman of L Company felt the immense pressure. In the hours before we went in, a friend of mine, Bill Lanahan, he was my age, told me, "Steve, I'm scared." I just said, "I'm scared too." Around 3:30 in the morning, the order came. Kellman, Lanagan, and nearly 200 other men from L Company began the clumsy descent down swaying scramble nets from their transport ship, a drill they had practiced countless times. The nets were slapping against the ship's hull, and the small landing craft bobbed violently below, Kellman recalled. You had to time your jump into the boat for when it rose on a wave, because there was a gap. We hadn't practiced that part. We'd gone down nets, but always in calm water. This was something else entirely. German bunker perspective, looking out to sea. A German soldier in a concrete gun emplacement watches, contemplating the impending invasion. Staff Sergeant Harley A. Reynolds of B Company was on the USS Samuel Chase. When we loaded into the assault boats, he recounted, We climbed down cargo nets. The sea was rough from a recent storm. Some men got hurt just dropping in. We left the transport and moved in single file toward the rendezvous point, following a small light on the craft in front. The light would vanish in the trough of a wave, then reappear. I worried we would collide. I saw the phosphorescent wake our boat left behind and thought the Germans must be able to see it and target us. The famed writer Ernest Hemingway, covering the invasion for Collier's magazine, was in an LCVP with soldiers of the 16th Infantry. He observed, as the boat crested a wave, green water turned white and crashed over the men, their weapons and explosive cases. Ahead, the coast of France was visible. The gray shapes of the attack transports were behind us now, and boats crawled across the sea. From the top of a wave, you could see the low silhouettes of cruisers and two battleships, Texas and Arkansas, firing broadside at the shore. You saw the bright flashes from their guns and the brown smoke blowing away on the wind. We circled in our landing craft for what felt like an eternity, Kelman remembered. The battleships were firing and bombers were flying overhead. I'd peek over the side and see smoke and fire, and I thought, we're giving them hell. There won't be much left. As we moved closer, we passed yellow life rafts. I assumed they were from a downed plane or maybe the amphibious tanks that had sunk. The men in the rafts gave us a thumbs up as we passed. We thought, if they're not worried, why should we be? But then we got closer, and we could hear machine gun rounds striking the side of our boat and hitting the front ramp. In training, they told us how everything would happen in order, Harley Reynolds said. But seeing it all unfold was overwhelming. The sheer scale was stunning. We were supposed to keep our heads down, but I felt I needed to see what was happening. I looked around many times, and what I saw was horrifying. What Reynolds witnessed was a heavily defended beach, almost completely untouched by the preceding Allied bombardment. The massive aerial and naval assault that was supposed to vaporize German defenses, clear minefields, and obliterate the low-grade troops believed to be guarding the coast had simply failed. The bombers, flying over cloud cover, had dropped their payloads too far inland, striking nothing but French fields and livestock. SFX, distant muffled explosions. The Navy, concerned about hitting their own men, also aimed too far. The underwater demolition teams sent to clear obstacles had been mostly killed, wounded, or lost their equipment. Of the 32 amphibious tanks meant to support the infantry, all but 5 had sunk, taking their crews with them. Even rocket-launching craft that got close to shore missed their targets. There wasn't a single crater on the beach for cover, and the German machine gunners were alert, with their weapons aimed at the landing zones. The most complex invasion in military history was teetering on the brink of absolute catastrophe before the first soldier had even set foot on sand. How could they possibly succeed? Even with a deadly reception waiting, the men in the Higgins boats were desperate to get on land. Most hadn't slept, plagued by anxiety. The first wave ate breakfast after midnight before loading into the pitching landing craft. The remnants of a storm that had already postponed the invasion made the English Channel exceptionally rough. The journey to shore took 3 to 4 agonizing hours. That time was sheer misery for the soldiers upon whom the fate of the free world rested. The small boats were tossed up, down, and side to side. One soldier said it was like being trapped on a never-ending roller coaster ride. Another called it like being inside a washing machine. The heavily equipped men struggled to stay upright on slick decks, often stumbling into one another. Huge waves crashed over the bows, drenching them in freezing seawater. The decks were soon awash with vomit. We were given a seasickness bag, but one wasn't enough, recalled PFC Roger Brugger of K Company. After our LCVP was lowered, we just circled. By then, everyone in the boat had used their bag and was throwing up on the deck. For many, the violent seasickness was worse than the fear of combat. Cinematographer Walter Halloran noted, "I don't think fear was the main thing. We were so sick, our only thought was, we have to get off this boat." An officer with the 1st Engineer Combat Battalion put it bluntly. It was literally a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea. We all agreed we'd rather face the devil, showing the Atlantic Wall defenses along the French coast. The Germans had done a masterful job fortifying the French coastline. From Cherbourg to Calais, it was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. Every inch of ground was covered by interlocking fields of fire from rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, and the feared 88mm cannons. The beaches were littered with underwater obstacles designed to tear open landing craft or detonate attached mines. The sand itself was heavily mined, backed by dense barbed wire. Beyond the wire lay concrete pillboxes, trench systems, and bunkers positioned for devastating crossfire. And all of this was before the high bluffs, which had their own network of defensive strongpoints. The entire system was overseen by one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He was a genius at defensive warfare, even when his forces were outmatched. On January 15, 1944, Rommel was put in command of Army Group B, responsible for defending northern France. He pushed his troops to exhaustion for 5 months, desperately trying to reinforce Hitler's Atlantic Wall. He had over 4 million mines laid between Cherbourg and Calais, sensing the invasion was close. MC the Fortifications. Despite these efforts, Rommel privately feared it wouldn't be enough. The problem wasn't the fortifications, it was the soldiers. Germany's best troops were gone, killed, or wounded over nearly 5 years of war in places like Stalingrad and North Africa. With the Soviets applying immense pressure on the Eastern Front, Normandy was defended by understrength units of older men and conscripts, equipped with bicycles and horses for transport. However, unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, a reorganized motorized infantry division, the 352nd, had been moved into the Omaha Beach area to support the 716th Coastal Defense Division. Though not a top-tier unit, having been battered on the Eastern Front, the 352nd added 10,000 more German soldiers to the sector than the Allies had anticipated. The only true threat to the invasion was the Panzer divisions, but they were held far from the coast by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, to protect them from Allied air power. Worse, Rommel couldn't deploy these armored units himself. They required personal authorization from Adolf Hitler, who remained convinced the main invasion would strike at Calais. To make matters worse, on the night of June 5 to 6th, many German commanders were away from their posts. Some were at a war games exercise in Rennes, 90 miles away. Rommel himself was in Germany, planning to plead with Hitler for more authority and to visit his wife on her 50th birthday. The first wave of landing craft, carrying the 2nd Battalion of the 16th Infantry, somehow navigated the shelling and obstacles to get the men near the shore. But the landing at Easy Red was chaos. A strong current pushed nearly every boat a half-mile or more east of its intended target. Men who had memorized landmarks for months were now completely disoriented. Officers and NCOs were often the first to be shot as they led their men off the ramps. Units were instantly mixed, separated, and lost. Leaderless and under a terrifying barrage, the seasick and shaken survivors struggled ashore and crawled toward a thin bank of rounded stones, the shingle, at the high tide line. There, they huddled together, simply waiting to die. On Fox Green Beach, the situation was just as grim. 5 boat sections of F Company were scattered over 1,000 yards of sand. 2 sections that landed together in front of German positions were cut to pieces by machine guns and mortars as they exited their LCVPs. In minutes, 6 officers and half the company were casualties. The remaining section of E Company reached a shoreline where water and sand erupted from constant artillery and mortar impacts. 4 boat sections of the 116th Infantry's E Company also drifted into this sector and met the same horrific fate. Men threw away their equipment in the water and scrambled for the beach, but the sand offered no safety. Minefields and machine guns were ahead, and the rising tide was behind them. All around was death, carnage, and confusion. For those who made it to the beach alive, there was a pervading sense that nobody would survive this. MC the Schreiber 5. Captain Ed Wozensky, commander of E Company, later described the experience. Machine gun fire was rattling against the ramp as we grounded. The ramp wouldn't go down. 4 or 5 men had to batter it until it finally fell, and they fell with it. The men rushed out into shoulder-deep water under intense machine gun and anti-tank fire. The moment the last man was off, the boat took 2 direct hits from an anti-tank gun and blew up. All the men were wading ashore into that intense fire. Because of the heavy sea and their heavy loads, nobody could run. It was just a slow, methodical walk with absolutely no cover toward the enemy's high ground. Men fell all around, and the water turned red with their blood. Some men stepped on underwater mines and were blown out of the sea. The rest staggered onto the obstacle-covered beach. Here, in pure exhaustion, men dropped to the sand, only to get up and push forward through a runlet of water that threatened to pull them under. Men were falling everywhere, but the survivors kept moving and finally reached a pile of shale at the high water mark. This gave temporary protection from the enemy guns, but his mortars were still raising hell. Captain Joe Dawson's G Company approached Easy Red around 0700. When we landed, it was total chaos because the first wave from E and F Company had been virtually decimated. They were badly disorganized when they landed. I was fortunate to land with all my men at our designated spot. I was the first man off my boat, followed by my sergeants. Unfortunately, my boat was then hit directly, so the rest of my headquarters element was wiped out, along with the Navy fire control officer who was our link for support fire. That fire was supposed to neutralize the village of Colville, our objective. The situation was no better, and perhaps even worse, on the 116th Infantry section of the beach. At Dog Green, a company of the 116th was being systematically annihilated before even reaching the shore. One landing craft took 4 direct hits and disintegrated. Men leaving LCVPs were torn apart by gunfire. Others, jumping over the sides of their boats, were dragged underwater and drowned by the weight of their gear. Every officer in A Company, and most of its NCOs, were hit. A small 64-man company of Rangers landing behind A Company suffered a similar fate. They lost half their men. A company lost 2/3, and they hadn't even fired a shot. Further west, Rangers were trying to scale the sheer cliffs at Point du Hoc to attack a battery of 150mm guns, taking heavy casualties. They would later discover the guns had been moved inland, but they still accomplished their mission by destroying them. Some soldiers simply broke under the sheer horror of the beach. One young soldier from the 16th RCT barely survived a near miss from a German shell. "When that shell burst," he recalled, "I guess I panicked. I started crying. There was a wrecked ship to our right, and my buddies got me behind it, where I cried for what seemed like hours. I cried until no more tears would come. Suddenly, I felt something. A feeling went through my body, and I stopped crying and came to my senses." The soldier picked up his rifle and rejoined the fight. On Easy Red and Fox Green, the leading companies were trapped on the beach. MC the Church 6. The only way out was for individuals to risk everything. They had to crawl forward with wire cutters or Bangalore torpedoes, explosive-packed tubes, and expose themselves to withering fire to cut through the barbed wire. Several brave men tried. All were killed. Despite seeing the suicidal nature of the task, another soldier, Sergeant Philip Strechik of E Company, attempted the impossible. With every German gun seemingly aimed at him, Strechik sprinted through a storm of bullets toward the wire, snipped it, and waved for others to follow. Although E Company had been shattered, one of its surviving platoon leaders, Lieutenant John N. Spaulding, gathered the few men he could find. Facing a hurricane of rifle, machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire, and confronting dense minefields, Spaulding led his small group through the narrow gap Strechik had created. His goal was to attack the enemy positions east of a fortified beach exit designated E1. It was a desperate, almost foolish gamble, a handful of sick, soaked, and terrified soldiers attacking one of the most heavily defended points on Earth. It should have been impossible. SFX, intense but focused sound of a single skirmish. But somehow, incredibly, it worked. With Dawson's G Company providing covering fire, Spaulding and his men advanced, carving a path of destruction. The regimental report noted, of the 183 men in E Company that landed, 100 were dead, wounded, or missing. But the survivors, led by Spaulding, reduced the strong point, consisting of an anti-aircraft gun, 4 concrete shelters, 2 pillboxes, 5 machine guns, to wipe out the strong point covering the east side of exit E1. Extremely stubborn resistance was encountered. A close exchange of hand grenades and small arms fire ensued until the first platoon cornered approximately 20 Germans, and an officer who, overpowered, surrendered. Now it was Dawson's turn. I felt the obligation to lead my men off, because the only way they were going to get off was to follow me. We went over the shingle and into this minefield. We saw the body of a boy who had discovered the minefield and the mine, which killed him, but he showed us the way. Myself and 2 other men from my company started up the hill. There was a path that seemed to go in the right direction, so I followed it. About halfway up, I met Lieutenant Spaulding with what was left of his platoon. I think he had 2 squads. They joined us. My men were still back on the beach. Zoom in, close up on an officer's determined face. I told a private to go back and bring the men up. I said, "They've got to get off the beach. Tell them to come up here with me." They started to move, but I had gone ahead. Just before the crest of the ridge, it becomes almost vertical for about 10 feet. There was a log there, and I got behind it to see if my men were coming. I could see a single file developing off the beach when I heard a lot of noise just above me. Sure enough, there was a machine gun nest up there causing a lot of trouble. I was able to get within a few yards of them. I lobbed a couple of grenades in there and silenced them. That opened the beach up. It was a miracle. It was just one of those strange things that happen, that I was in the right spot. While the initial waves had drifted far off course, the boats carrying I and L companies, meant to land on Fox Green simultaneously with E and F on Easy Red, were pulled over a mile east, nearly ending up on Gold Beach in the British sector. By the time they corrected the error, Captain John R. Armelino's L Company had lost a boat that capsized miles offshore and was over 30 minutes late. Captain Kimball Richmond's Iron Company would take another hour to reach land. Originally aiming for the E3 draw, L Company's boats landed beyond the eastern edge of Fox Green, near low cliffs that offered some protection. Organizing his company there, Captain Armelino realized that although he'd lost almost half his men, his unit was largely intact, the only one of the first 8 companies that could still operate as a cohesive force. Among them was Private Steve Kellman. "We were trained when you hit the beach to never run in a straight line, you zigzag. When the ramp dropped, some guys ran straight, and many were cut down. The coxswain on our boat got us right onto the beach. The water wasn't even knee-deep. We had a huge advantage. We could run. We just ran like hell to the seawall. Once there, we were exhausted." MC the 7. Men in boats behind us, where the coxswains didn't get them close enough, had to hide behind the beach obstacles, thinking they offered cover. But that was a deadly mistake. Armelino decided to push inland toward the village of Le Grand Hameau. The only path up the bluffs was a draw labeled F1, which was guarded by 2 German strongpoints, numbers 60 and 61, but Kellman wouldn't make it that far. On the beach, all hell had broken loose, he said. Noise, smoke, dead bodies everywhere. We realized we were on the wrong beach. As we worked our way over, an artillery or mortar round must have landed 15 feet away. The man in front of me and I were both thrown backwards by the blast. I started crawling toward the seawall. I knew we had to move, so I used my rifle as a crutch to stand. I got up and then fell down. I didn't know what was wrong. I felt no pain, just numbness. I tried again and fell again. I pulled up my pant leg and saw blood. I was terrified. I took off my leggings, sprinkled sulfa powder on the wound, and wrapped it. As more waves came in, I gave my rifle to one man and my grenades to another. Then our company executive officer, Lieutenant Cutler, came by and said, "Come on, we're moving out." I said, "I can't." He looked at me and said, "Kellman, I didn't think I'd have any trouble with you." I said, "I can't walk, sir." He asked what was wrong. I showed him my leg and he said, "Oh, okay, I'll send an aid man." The man who had been in front of me was also hit in the leg. We lay there and talked while we waited. The shells kept coming. After one blast, I sat up and asked him, "How are you doing?" But he had been hit again and was dead. Now it was Captain Anthony Prucknall's K Company arriving at Fox Green. Intended as a reserve, they were forced into an assault role after I Company drifted east. PFC. Roger Brugger recalled, "As we neared the beach, shells were landing in the water and machine gun bullets whizzed over our heads. Our squad leader told the coxswain to run the boat right up on the beach. He did, and we got off on dry land." I remember thinking as I ran, with bullets kicking up sand on both sides, this is like a war movie. After we reached the shale wall, I looked back at our boat just as an 80 shell hit its engine, and it exploded. I watched another boat land, and as the men ran for the wall, one guy took a direct mortar hit. All I saw were 3 pieces of his body flying through the air. We were all sick and scared. The tide was coming in, and the beach was shrinking. K Company's 6 boats came under intense fire. 2 were destroyed by mines. The officers were wiped out in minutes. As Prucknell and his XO tried to organize the company, a shell landed, mortally wounding the XO. When Prucknell went to help him, another shell killed him instantly. A platoon commander, Lieutenant James L. Robinson, tried to rally the men, only to be killed by a sniper. Another lieutenant was wounded coming ashore. Taking command, Lieutenant Leo A. Stumbaugh organized a patrol from what was left, charged through enemy fire, and forced a German defensive position to fall back. MC the Batter for 8. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the German line on Omaha Beach was starting to break. First, Lieutenant Carl E. Wolfe, from Headquarters Company 3rd Battalion, remembered, "For a while, we had to dig in or just lay on the beach because of the fire. The beach was steep for about 20 to 30 yards, and at the top was a small berm that offered a little protection." But even there, Wolfe found himself in a nightmare. While lying there, I noticed the soldier near me was on his back, his whole leg split open to the bone. He was in shock, but there was nothing I could do except keep pulling him up as the tide rose. Nearby was half a body, the lower half completely gone. More units continued to pile up on the shore. Radio man Al Alvarez, with the 7th Field Artillery Battalion, recalled, "After what felt like hours, we finally left the relative safety of the beach obstacles. Crawling and dragging ourselves, we hid behind a mound of pebbles, a berm lined with hundreds of soldiers. Eddie King went back into the surf to pull in wounded men, then pointed to his head where blood was trickling down. There in the center of his helmet was a bullet hole. A round had gone straight through. I had to stick my hand in his helmet and felt mush, but it was just his hair soaked in blood. It was only a crease. But then a medic was called over. He sat with his back to the enemy to bandage Eddie, but was struck in the back. Both of us tried to bandage the medic, but he died. It seemed every German gun in range was firing relentlessly at the landing craft, at the men in the water, and at those huddled behind the shingle. Boats were blown apart. Wounded men unable to move were drowned by the rising tide. The cries of the injured filled the air, and anyone who tried to help them was often killed or wounded themselves. Some of the world's best soldiers were becoming casualties without even seeing the enemy. As the German fire reached its peak, it seemed impossible for the 1st Infantry Division to establish a beachhead, let alone push inland. The 16th Infantry Regiment, like the 116th, had been stopped cold. Annihilation felt inevitable. War correspondent Don Whitehead wrote, "The invasion on Omaha Beach was a dead standstill. The battle was being fought at the water's edge. I lay on the beach wanting to burrow into the gravel, and I thought, this time we have failed. God, we have failed. Nothing has moved from this beach, and soon over that bluff will come the Germans." But the Germans didn't come swarming down. The 16th's fiery commander, Colonel George A. Taylor, was now on the beach and began rallying his men. Seeing them huddled in fear, Taylor was filled with rage. Technician John E. Bistrica of C Company remembered one of the most famous moments of the war, a moment that perhaps turned the tide on Omaha Beach. Colonel Taylor came in after the assault waves. He was roaming up and down the beach. He yelled, "There are 2 kinds of people who are staying on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." I thought, well, somebody finally got this thing organized. I guess we're going to move out now. So we started up the draw. From their hiding places, men who had been paralyzed by fear slowly began to move. Many were killed or wounded the moment they exposed themselves, but a few brave captains, lieutenants, and sergeants turned to the terrified men beside them and gave a simple order: "Follow me." And they did. Don Whitehead later wrote, "There were many heroes on Omaha Beach that bloody day, but none of greater stature than Assistant 1st Division Commander Willard G. Wyman and Taylor. They formed the core of the steadying influence that slowly began to weld the 1st Division's broken spearhead into a fighting force under the muzzles of enemy guns. John B. Ellery, a platoon sergeant, witnessed this leadership firsthand. "I saw a captain and 2 lieutenants who demonstrated courage beyond belief as they struggled to bring order to the chaos. They managed to get some of the men organized and moving up the hill. One of the lieutenants was hit, but he led a small group of 6 or 7 to the top. It looked like he got hit again on the way. Another lieutenant carried one of his wounded men about 30 meters before getting hit himself. When you talk about combat leadership at Normandy, the credit has to go to the company-grade officers and senior NCOs who led the way." Quote, "You can't buy valor, and you can't pull heroes off an assembly line." While a storm of bullets and shrapnel continued to fall, Sergeant Harley Reynolds looked up. "I could see a narrow pond ahead with marsh grass. Between us and the pond was wire strung on the roadbed, and beyond that, a 3-strand wire fence. A soldier with a Bangalore torpedo slid it under the wire and blew a gap, but was immediately shot and killed. Without hesitating, Reynolds and his men charged through the opening and into a flooded anti-tank ditch. I was the first across the pond. As I paused to take off my life preserver, I looked back. I heard my name and saw Dale Heap about halfway across. Dale was a machine gunner and the platoon comedian. He had been shot through his upper arm. He was holding his one arm up and pointing his gun tripod at it, saying, 'See, I didn't drop the tripod.' Always the comedian, he was actually laughing. He kept yelling, 'Stateside! Stateside!' He handed the tripod to his assistant, and we had a battlefield promotion right there in the pond. Dale waved goodbye and headed back to the beach. He made it stateside. At 30 hours, a Navy beachmaster signaled the fleet, no more landing craft. There was no room. At that moment, around 50 LCTs and LCIs were circling offshore, unable to find a place to land. Their skippers could see the previous wave's craft sinking, burning, or stuck on obstacles, with explosions all around them. There were no safe paths. This stalemate would last for 2 more hours. Seeing the infantry being pounded, the Navy decided its firepower had to be brought in closer, even at great risk to the ships. A group of destroyers moved near the shore and began blasting German positions, soldiers advancing up the bluffs. Almost imperceptibly, the invaders began to chip away at Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Pillboxes and trenches were being hit by the Navy's guns. The pinned-down Americans were no longer pinned down. As German fire weakened, the Yanks crawled through the wire and minefields, an inexorable swarm of olive drab, determined to overcome everything in their path. The Germans in the fortifications, ears bleeding from concussions, choking on concrete dust, began to scramble out the back of their bunkers, only to be cut down as they tried to escape. The tide of battle had finally turned. June 6, 1944, particularly at Omaha Beach, was a bloody, terrible day, worse than anyone had imagined. The human cost was immense. Some 291 landing craft were lost. In the 1st Infantry Division alone, an estimated 18 officers and 168 enlisted men were killed or died of wounds. 7 officers and 351 men were missing, and 45 officers and 575 men were wounded. Attached elements of the 29th Infantry Division also suffered horribly, with 328 killed, 281 wounded, and 134 missing. Yet, thousands more had stormed ashore over the bodies of their comrades, braved the fire, crawled through minefields, and fought their way to the top of the bluffs by early afternoon. Those who fell on Normandy's shore had not died for nothing. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a fortification that took years and billions to build, had been cracked open by invaders in a single morning. The first day of the Battle of Normandy belonged to the Allies, thanks in large part to the selfless courage of the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Nearly a year of brutal fighting remained, and many who survived D-Day would not see the final victory. But the Allies were back on the continent to stay. There would be no turning back. If you were moved by the courage displayed on these shores, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to W2 for more stories of valor.